Confirmation received. We take him past the city line. The little girl froze as the bodyguards switched to Chinese, outlining exactly how they would drug the Mafia boss and make him disappear. 30 seconds later, she was sprinting across the pavement in her red dress, grabbing Alexandra Duarte's sleeve just as he reached for the car door, and he still got in. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss what's ahead. I've got another unforgettable story coming tomorrow. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing people tuned in from all over the world. Okay, let's get back into it. San Francisco burned gold at the edges of evening. The financial district's glass towers caught the last light of the dying sun and held it amber, bleeding down walls of steel and reflection, turning the skyline into something that looked almost sacred, almost untouchable. Traffic moved in slow, deliberate pulses below, luxury cars gliding silently between intersections as the city shifted from its daytime skin into something darker, more electric. Street lamps flickered on one by one, though the sky hadn't fully surrendered yet, that strange in-between hour, the city's most honest moment when the light was neither day nor night, and everything was briefly, beautifully exposed. It was the kind of evening that made ordinary people pause and look up. Alexandre Duarte never looked up. He came through the revolving doors of the Meridian corporate tower, like a man who had walked out of 1,000 buildings just like this one, unhurried, unimpressed, carrying nothing but the quiet weight of his own authority. The automatic doors parted before him. The evening air met him first. Black suit, no tie. The collar of his shirt open at the throat, deliberate in its casualness, not a man who forgot to dress, but a man who simply didn't require the formality. The jacket sat perfectly across broad shoulders, tailored with the kind of precision that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His dark hair was swept back, severe and clean against the angular lines of his face. His jaw was set, his expression unreadable, not blank, unreadable. There was a difference. Blank was nothing. His face held something coiled and still, the way deep water holds its current. And then there were the tattoos. They crept up from beneath his collar, dark ink climbing the left side of his neck in patterns that were neither decorative nor meaningless. On his hands, both of them, the same language continued, wrapping his knuckles and disappearing beneath his cuffs. They were not the tattoos of a young man's careless night. They were a record. A history written on skin by someone who had lived in places where such things were currency, where what you were willing to mark on your body told others everything about what you were willing to do. People on the sidewalk moved without being asked to, not dramatically, not in fear. In the subtle, instinctive way that crowds always responded to Alexandre Duarte, a slight widening of space, a peripheral awareness, a collective and unconscious decision to give him room. He hadn't always had that effect. He had earned it. And he wore it now the way other men wore watches without thinking about it, but always present. The black Mercedes was already at the curb, engine idling so softly it was less a sound than a sensation. A long, sleek body, deeply polished, reflecting the amber towers above in its hood like a dark mirror. The headlights glowed cool and steady against the dusk. His protection detail was in position. To the right, near the rear passenger door, stood the larger of the two bald, built with the kind of mass that suggested not a gym but a different kind of life entirely. A life of corners and consequences. He held the door handle loosely, eyes forward, jaw set. He'd been on the team 4 months. His file was clean. Behind, near the building's entrance, the second man held his post tall, broad through the chest, dark-suited, his gaze moving slowly across the street in practiced surveillance. Disciplined, measured, professional in every visible way. Alexandre had approved both hires himself. That, too, would matter before the night was over. He had spent the past 2 hours in a private meeting on the 34th floor, the kind of meeting that produced no minutes, no recordings, no paper trail of any kind. The CEO of the Meridian Group was a man who understood how certain relationships worked, what they required, what they protected, and what happened when those terms were violated. The conversation had been productive, quiet, the kind that moved money and silence in equal measure. Alexandre descended the front steps now, without breaking stride, the city noise rising gently around him, a taxi horn, 2 blocks east. The electric murmur of the intersection ahead, cycling through its lights. The low atmospheric hum of 10,000 lives, running their courses on either side of his. He noticed none of it. He was already thinking about the next thing. He was always thinking about the next thing. That was how empires held. not by celebrating what was secured, but by anticipating what was not. He did not see the lobby behind him, where a young woman sat in a chair near the building's lower reception area, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes on the elevator as though she could will it to open. She had been waiting for 40 minutes. She was applying for an administrative position, a long shot, she knew, but a necessary one. She needed stability, she needed income, she needed this building to give her something to hold on to. Beside her, patient and still in the way only children can be when they sense that something important is happening to the adults around them, sat her daughter, 7 years old. Dark eyes that absorbed everything quietly, her hair loose around her face. She wore a deep burgundy dress, the color of red wine, of autumn leaves, of something ceremonial that fell softly to her knees. She sat with her hands in her lap, watching the lobby's glass front doors, watching the street beyond, watching the people who came and went with the calm, unhurried attention of a child who had learned early that the world revealed itself to those who simply paid attention. Her name was Angel Walker. She had learned Mandarin from her grandmother. The old woman had been patient and insistent in equal measure, convinced without being able to explain exactly why that the language would matter someday, that it would be useful in ways neither of them could predict. Angel had believed her. She always believed her grandmother. She was watching the glass doors when the two suited men outside near the black car leaned toward one another. They stood close, their voices low, their expressions calm, the practiced calm of men who were certain they could not be understood. They spoke quietly, in Mandarin, and Angel Walker, sitting 30 feet away behind plate glass, watched their mouths move and understood every word. Her small hands tightened in her lap, her breath caught. And somewhere beneath the amber glow of the evening sky, Alexandre Duarte took his first step toward the car. The lobby was quiet in the way that large buildings go quiet after hours, not silent, but emptied of urgency. The marble floors reflected the overhead lighting in long, pale streaks. A security guard sat behind the front desk, scrolling through something on his phone. A businessman crossed toward the elevators without looking up. 2 women in lanyards passed through the side corridor, talking in low, tired voices about nothing that mattered. No one was paying attention to the little girl by the glass doors. That was the thing about Angel Walker. She had spent enough of her 7 years in waiting rooms, in lobbies, in the background of adult situations, to know how to be invisible when she needed to be. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her burgundy dress smooth across her knees, and she watched. She was good at watching. Her mother had been gone for nearly 40 minutes, now upstairs somewhere, in a room Angel couldn't see, trying to convince strangers that she was worth a chance. Angel understood more about that than her mother knew. She had heard the conversations. The bills mentioned in hushed tones after bedtime. The phone calls made in the kitchen when Angel was supposed to be asleep. She understood that today was important. She understood that her job, right now, was to sit still and not be a problem. So she sat, and she watched the street through the glass. That was when she noticed the 2 men shift. They were standing near the black car at the curb, both of them in dark suits, both of them wearing the particular stillness of men paid to look like they weren't thinking about anything. But something changed in the way they held themselves. A barely visible lean, a closing of distance. One of them glanced left, then right, with the casual sweep of someone checking without appearing to check. Then the taller one spoke. Low, controlled, his lips barely moving. And the language that came out of his mouth stopped Angel completely. Mandarin. Her grandmother's voice arrived in her memory without warning, patient and warm, sitting across a small kitchen table, tapping each character onto a worn notebook page. Pay attention, little one. Language is how the world keeps its secrets. If you can listen, truly listen, nothing stays hidden from you. Angel had thought those lessons were about connection, about heritage, about staying close to a woman she loved who was getting older, and spoke of home in a way that made her eyes go soft and distant. She had not thought they would ever matter like this. She leaned forward slightly on her chair, her small hands pressing flat against the seat on either side of her. The glass muffled the sound but didn't kill it. She could read the cadence, catch the syllables. She focused the way her grandmother had taught her. Block out the noise beneath. Find the thread of meaning. And the thread, when she found it, turned her blood cold. Confirmation received. The shorter one, matter of fact, like he was reporting a delivery. The taller one nodded once. We drive him past the city line. Highway 1 north. There's a stretch after the second turnoff where no one checks. A pause. The shorter man glanced toward the building's entrance. The drink is already prepared, in the back compartment. He'll be unconscious within 12 minutes, cooperative enough before that. And after? Disposal. Somewhere they don't search. Angel stopped breathing. She sat very still the way prey goes still. Not from calm, but from the sudden, overwhelming understanding that something enormous and terrible is close. Her heart was not pounding. It had simply dropped, heavy and cold, into the floor of her chest, and was sitting there, waiting. They were talking about the man in the black suit. She knew it without question. There was no other person these men were here for. She had seen the way they stood around him, not beside him, the way friends stand, but around him, the way guards stand, the way walls stand. He was the reason they were here, and now they were describing his death in the same tone a person might use to describe directions to a gas station. 12 minutes. Dispose of him. Somewhere they don't search. Her grandmother had given her this. A language. A key. And the door it was opening was a terrible one. She looked back toward the elevator. Her mother wasn't coming. Not yet. Maybe not for another 20 minutes. Maybe longer. And even if she called out, even if she ran upstairs somehow, what would she say? What could her mother do? Who would believe a 7-year-old girl who had overheard men speaking Mandarin outside a building in San Francisco and translated it and decided it meant what she thought it meant? What if she was wrong? She pressed her hands together in her lap and made herself go through it again, carefully, word by word, the way her grandmother had trained her to verify before she was certain. Not the impression of language, the actual words. She was not wrong. He'll be unconscious before he realizes. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes stung not from crying. Not yet. But from the effort of staying controlled, when every instinct she had was screaming at her to run to someone, anyone, and make them understand what she had just heard. She looked toward the front doors again. The man in the black suit was not outside yet, but the meeting had to end soon. Her mother had told her it was a business building, that important people came here, that meetings ended, and people left. And when he left, when he walked toward that car, Angel stood up. Her legs felt strange, thin and unreliable, like they belonged to someone else. The burgundy hem of her dress fell to her knees, and she smoothed it once, a small and automatic gesture of composure that her mother had taught her without meaning to, by doing it herself in hard moments. She moved toward the glass doors. She didn't know what she was going to say. She didn't know if he would look at her or through her, or simply keep walking the way adults always kept walking when a child approached them in public with something urgent written on her face. She only knew one thing with complete and devastating clarity. She had to try. Outside, the evening light was fading fast, and from the elevator behind her, the floors ticked downward her mother, still unaware, still hoping, still believing this was simply another ordinary evening in a city full of them. It wasn't. The revolving doors exhaled her into the evening. The air outside was cooler than she expected, that particular San Francisco cool that arrived with the dusk, carrying the faint salt of the bay and the metallic edge of a city in motion. Angel stepped onto the wide stone steps of the Meridian Tower and immediately felt how small she was. The street spread out before her in every direction, full of noise and movement and adult certainty, everyone around her operating on the assumption that they knew exactly where they were going and why. She did not feel certain. She felt terrified, but she kept moving. Alexandra was at the base of the steps, maybe 30 feet ahead, moving toward the black Mercedes with the unhurried stride of a man who had never once been made to wait for anything. The bald bodyguard already had the rear passenger door open, one thick hand resting on the frame, his eyes forward. The second guard, tall, positioned slightly behind, had turned his gaze to the street, scanning in that slow, professional arc. The two men near the car, the ones who had spoken, they looked exactly the same as they had through the glass, composed, disciplined, suited. There was nothing in their faces that said monster. There was nothing in their faces that said anything at all. And that, Angel realized, was the most frightening thing about them. That evil, when it was organized, looked exactly like professionalism. She moved down the steps. Her heart was a fist, knocking against the inside of her ribs. Her burgundy dress caught the evening breeze and pressed against her legs. She kept her eyes on the man in the black suit and told herself the way her grandmother had told her to speak to herself, when she was afraid you already decided. Now just move. Sir. Her voice came out smaller than she intended, lost immediately in the ambient noise of the intersection, the idling engines, the distant conversation of two men on the corner. Alexandra didn't slow, didn't turn. She moved faster. Sir, please. Closer now. 10 feet. She reached the bottom of the steps and her shoes hit the pavement, and she was moving at something between a walk and a run, the way children move when they're trying to be urgent without being wild. And she reached out her hand, and her fingers caught the fabric of his sleeve, just the edge of it, just enough, and she said it again, louder this time. Please, don't get in the car. Everything stopped. Not the city. The city didn't care. But everything in the immediate orbit of that black Mercedes contracted into sudden, sharp attention. The bald guard's hand tightened on the doorframe. The tall guard behind turned fast, controlled, and took one step forward. Two of the suited men near the hood shifted their weight in unison, a subtle realignment, like a mechanism adjusting, and Alexandra Duarte stopped walking. He looked down. He did it slowly, not with surprise, not with irritation, but with the measured deliberateness of a man who had trained himself never to react before he had assessed. His dark eyes found her face and stayed there. Up close, he was larger than he had seemed through the glass. The tattoos on his neck were more intricate, layered, deliberate, each line placed with intention. His jaw was sharp. His expression was the kind that gave nothing away and seemed to have been built specifically for that purpose. Angel looked up at him and did not look away. She was shaking. She could feel it in her hands, in the backs of her knees, in the slight unsteadiness of her breath, but she had come this far and her grandmother's voice was in her ear. If you know something, you say it. You don't wait for permission to tell the truth. I heard them, she said. Her voice was low, almost a whisper now, instinct driving her to keep it between only the two of them. The men by your car, they were speaking Mandarin. I understood them. She swallowed. They said they have something in the car. A drink. They're going to give it to you and it will make you, they said, unconscious. And then they're going to drive you past the city and… She stopped. She couldn't say the last part out loud. Not here. Not with them standing 20 feet away. She didn't need to. Something moved behind Alexandra's eyes, so brief, so contained, that if she hadn't been looking directly at him, she would have missed it entirely. It wasn't fear. It wasn't shock. It was something more precise than either of those things. A recalibration. The almost imperceptible adjustment of a man whose mind had just received a piece of information and was already, quietly, rearranging everything around it. He studied her face for 3 full seconds. She watched him notice the steadiness in her eyes despite the trembling in her hands. She watched him register that she was not performing. She watched him decide. His expression didn't change. "What's your name?" he said. His voice was quiet, controlled, like the engine of the Mercedes, powerful in its restraint. "Angel." He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, a motion so smooth and brief that no one watching from a distance would have registered it as anything more than straightening his collar, and his thumb moved across his phone screen 4 times. A coded message. Sent. Follow. No lights. He slid the phone back into his pocket, and then he did the thing that made Angel's stomach drop completely through the pavement. He looked away from her. Not dismissively, not cruelly, but with the finality of a man who had already made his decision and was now executing it. He straightened slightly, his jaw set. His eyes moved to the bald guard holding the door, and he gave the smallest nod, the nod of a man who had simply finished whatever brief distraction had delayed him. "Sir," Angel started again, her voice breaking at the edge. "Go back inside," he said quietly, not unkindly, but with a certainty that left no space for negotiation. He stepped toward the car. Angel stood frozen on the pavement, her hand still half extended, her burgundy dress perfectly still now in the sudden absence of wind. She watched the door open. She watched him fold himself into the back seat. With the calm of a man who feared nothing, she watched the door close. The bald guard settled into the front passenger seat. The engine, already running, simply shifted a barely audible deepening, like a held breath released, and the black Mercedes pulled smoothly away from the curb. Angel stood alone on the pavement and watched it go. Behind her, the lobby doors were still open. Her mother was still upstairs, and somewhere in the back seat of that car, in the dark, Alexandra Duarte rode toward something only he and she knew was coming. The city slid past the windows like a film reel. Streetlights, storefronts, intersections cycling through their colors with mechanical indifference. The black Mercedes moved through San Francisco's evening traffic with the smooth authority of a vehicle that had never once been in a hurry because it had never needed to be. Other cars yielded without knowing why. Lanes opened. The city parted. the way it always parted for things that carried invisible weight. In the back seat, Alexandre Duarte sat with his hands resting loosely on his knees. He did not look at the guard beside him. He looked at the window. This was not unusual. He rarely spoke in transit. His men knew this, the original ones, the ones who had been with him long enough to understand that his silences were not absence but concentration. The back seat of a moving car was where he thought, where he processed, where he made the quiet decisions that later appeared to the world as inevitable outcomes. Tonight his mind was extraordinarily still. Not peaceful. Still the way a held blade is still. The way a man is still when he is counting seconds and has decided exactly what each one of them is worth. The guard driving had not spoken. He sat correctly, both hands on the wheel, mirrors checked, speed measured. His name, according to the file Alexandra had approved 4 months ago, was Raymond Holt, former private security contractor. Clean record, strong references, the kind of resume that took effort to build or effort to fabricate. The guard in the back seat, positioned to Alexandra's left, was called Dario Cruz, slightly shorter, compact through the shoulders. He had a stillness about him that Alexandra had initially read as professionalism. He was reconsidering that reading now. 3 minutes into the drive, neither man had spoken. The city was beginning to thin at the edges, the dense commercial blocks giving way to wider streets, longer gaps between buildings, the skyline behind them growing rather than surrounding. They were moving north, Highway 1. Alexandra knew this road. He had traveled it many times, for many reasons, none of them the reason these men intended. Past the city line, a stretch after the second turnoff where no one checks. A little girl in a burgundy dress had given him those words on a pavement outside a corporate tower. She had been shaking. Her eyes had been steady anyway. And in the 30 seconds he had looked at her face, really looked, the way he looked at things when the information mattered, he had understood something with complete certainty. She was telling the truth. Children did not fabricate with that quality of detail. They did not describe drug timelines and disposal routes with the flat, factual calm of someone reporting what they had actually heard. She hadn't dramatized. She hadn't embellished. She had simply told him what she knew, in the quietest voice she could manage, with her small hand barely touching his sleeve. He had believed her in the first 10 seconds. Everything after that had been performance. 4 minutes. The console between the front seats held a drinks caddy, 2 small glass bottles of still water, a third with a pale amber liquid he didn't recognize, sealed with a simple cap. It had not been there this morning. He had registered it the moment he settled into the seat, but had allowed his gaze to pass over it the way his gaze passed over many things, noting without acknowledging. Dario shifted slightly beside him. A small movement, barely anything. A repositioning of weight, a subtle adjustment of posture, the kind of movement a person made when they were preparing to do something and their body knew it before their face did. Alexandra kept his eyes on the window. His breathing stayed even. "Long drive this evening," Dario said. Casual. Perfectly casual. The voice of a man making conversation. Alexandra replied. Another silence. Then, from the front. "Can I offer you something, sir?" "Water, perhaps." "It's been a long day." Raymond's voice. Even. Solicitous. Alexandra let 2 full seconds pass. "Thank you," he said. He watched Raymond's hand reach for the caddy in his peripheral vision. Not the water. The amber bottle. He heard the soft crack of the seal breaking. The sound was very small and very loud at the same time. The bottle appeared over his left shoulder. Alexandra took it. He raised it toward his mouth. He did not drink. The glass touched his lower lip, and he tilted it just enough, just the precise angle of a man taking a sip, and then he lowered it again, and rested it against his knee, and said nothing, and the Mercedes continued north. 40 seconds passed. Then Dario turned. Not gradually, not conversationally. He turned with the sudden, committed motion of a man who had been given a signal, internal or otherwise, that enough time had elapsed. His left hand came up fast, moving toward Alexandra's right arm, fingers open, reaching for the wrist. Alexandra was faster. His elbow drove backward and left in a single explosive motion, sharp, compact, targeting the exact point where jaw met neck. The impact landed with a sound like a book dropped flat on a hard floor. Dario's head snapped sideways. His grip never closed. Raymond reacted from the front, a lurch of the shoulder, a hand leaving the wheel, and the Mercedes immediately veered, drifting hard into the adjacent lane. A horn screamed from somewhere to the left. Tires found asphalt in a long, ugly shriek. Alexandra drove his right hand forward over the headrest and locked his forearm across Raymond's throat from behind, not crushing. Controlling his body, twisting in the seat with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned long ago that a fight in a confined space was won by whoever moved first, and meant it most. The car swerved again. Dario was recovering, hands up, reaching, and Alexandra released Raymond just long enough to drive his palm backward into Dario's face. A short, brutal strike, and the man folded against the door with a sound somewhere between a gasp and a grunt. The Mercedes was crossing the lane dividers now. Tires screaming, city lights smearing across the windows in long, distorted streaks, and then headlights. Behind them, closing fast, no siren, no markings. Just 2 points of white light accelerating through the dark, with purpose and direction, eating the distance between them, with the focused intent of men who had been waiting for exactly this moment. His men. Raymond saw them too. His foot hit the accelerator. The Mercedes surged, and Alexandra tightened every muscle in his body, reset his grip, and prepared for what came next. The night outside was a blur, but inside the car, everything was perfectly, violently clear. The Mercedes didn't stop willingly. Raymond's foot stayed on the accelerator even as the car behind them closed the gap with mechanical certainty headlights filling the rear window, washing the interior in cold white light. The engine surged, the speedometer climbed. Outside, the city's northern edge had dissolved entirely into dark open road, the kind of road that had no witnesses and no streetlights, and nothing on either side but the flat, indifferent dark of land that didn't care what happened on it. Alexandra knew this kind of road. He had used it himself, for exactly the reasons these men had chosen it. He drove his forearm back across Raymond's throat harder this time, no longer controlling. Now committing, and felt the driver's body react the way bodies always reacted when air became a question rather than a guarantee. The hands on the wheel faltered, the accelerator pressure dropped, and the Mercedes, suddenly without confident direction, began to drift. Dario came at him from the left again. He was bleeding from his nose, a thin dark line in the poor light, and his eyes had lost the professional composure that had made him appear trustworthy for 4 months. What was underneath it was uglier and more honest. He lunged across the seat with both hands reaching for Alexandra's collar, trying to use his body weight as the weapon his stunned hands could no longer manage alone. Alexandra released Raymond, pivoted, and met him. His right hand caught Dario's wrist mid-reach and twisted a torque applied with the knowledge of exactly how much pressure a joint required before it became a liability. Dario made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a scream. His body curled instinctively around the pain. Alexandra used that curl, that automatic folding inward, to drive the man's face down toward the seat with controlled and deliberate force. He held him there, one hand. The other braced against the door. In the front, Raymond was losing the car. Without consistent hands on the wheel and a foot that had lifted off the accelerator in the involuntary response to being choked, the Mercedes had begun its own decision-making and vehicles on dark open roads. Left to themselves, made poor choices. It drifted right. The shoulder of the road appeared in the headlights. Gravel pinged against the undercarriage in a sudden sharp percussion, then the car behind hit them. Not a collision, a tactical contact, a precise application of weight from behind and to the left that pushed the Mercedes sideways, without destroying it, the way a firm hand redirects rather than strikes. The impact jolted through the frame. Raymond's head hit the side window. His hands left the wheel entirely. The Mercedes came to a stop, half on the road and half on the gravel shoulder, tilted at a slight angle, front headlights illuminating a strip of dry grass, and nothing beyond it. Silence. Not complete silence. The engine was still running. Somewhere behind them, 2 car doors opened, sounds of unhurried, purposeful movement. Boots on asphalt, the creak of hinges, men who had been waiting, and were now arriving. Alexandra straightened in the back seat. He was breathing hard, not from fear, from exertion, the kind of breathing that followed violence when the violence had been necessary and controlled, and was now finished. He looked at Dario, folded against the door to his left, cradling his wrist, a thin line of blood from his nose catching the light. He looked at Raymond in the front seat, dazed, listing slightly sideways, one hand pressed against the window where his head had struck it. Neither man was going anywhere. The rear door opened. The face that appeared was one Alexandra recognized in the way he recognized very few things with genuine trust. Broad, dark-eyed, a scar along the left jaw that had never been explained in any conversation but whose origins Alexandra knew precisely. His name was Garrett, and he had been with Alexandra for 11 years, which in Alexandra's world was a measurement not of time but of survival. "Sir, one word, a complete sentence. Pull them out," Alexandra said. He stepped out of the car himself, straightening his jacket by instinct, a small, automatic gesture of reassertion, the body reclaiming its posture after it had been required to abandon it. The night air hit him. Cool. Clean. Carrying the distant sound of the highway somewhere south of them, ordinary traffic moving through an ordinary night, completely unaware of what was unfolding 2 miles from it. Raymond was first dragged from the front seat with the efficient, emotionless handling of men who did not require instruction in how to move a person who didn't want to be moved. He hit the asphalt on his knees. His hands were secured before he registered it was happening. Dario came next, slower, his wrist held at a careful angle against his body. He stumbled on the gravel shoulder and was steadied not gently, but sufficiently before being placed beside Raymond. 2 men, kneeling on dark asphalt, the headlights of both vehicles cutting across them from different angles, cross-illuminating their faces with the quality of light that leaves nowhere to hide. Alexandre stood before them. He said nothing for a long moment. He simply looked. This was something his men understood, that his silences in moments like this were not emptiness but pressure, building and accumulating in the space between his eyes and whoever was receiving them. Dario looked at the ground. Raymond held his gaze for approximately 4 seconds before his eyes moved away. "Who sent you?" Alexandra said. Not a question. The grammatical absence of the question mark was deliberate. He was not asking whether they would answer. He was indicating that the answer would be provided, and that the only variable was how much time passed before it was. Raymond's jaw tightened. Garrett moved. 1 minute later, Raymond spoke. "A name, an organization, a rival syndicate moving north through the territory, funding internal fractures, buying access through newly placed personnel, a patient. Surgical strategy that had taken months to construct, and approximately 90 seconds to unravel here on a dark road with gravel under 2 men's knees." Alexandra absorbed it. His face gave nothing, but behind his eyes, something cold and absolute was already forming, not rage, which was imprecise and expensive, but resolution, which was neither. He looked at Garrett. "Take them," he said. "Separately. I want everything." He turned back toward the road. Somewhere south of him, the city glowed against the sky. And somewhere inside a corporate tower lobby, a little girl in a burgundy dress was still waiting for her mother to come back downstairs. He stood on the asphalt a moment longer than necessary, breathing, thinking about small hands and steady eyes, and a voice that had been shaking and told the truth anyway. Then he walked back toward the car. There was still work to do. Power, Alexandra had learned early, was rarely loud. The men who shouted about what they controlled were always the ones with the least of it. Real power moved quietly through systems, through people, through the careful placement of trust in the right hands and the careful withdrawal of it from the wrong ones. It built structures that looked legitimate from the outside and served entirely different purposes from within. It was patient. It planned in seasons, not days. Whoever had sent Raymond and Dario understood this. That was what kept Alexandre's mind working through the night and into the following morning. Not the betrayal itself, which was a known risk in his world, a cost of operating at the level he operated at, but the quality of it, the sophistication, the months of preparation it would have required, the access. Someone had gotten very close. He sat in the back room of a building in the Tenderloin that appeared, from the street, to be an import business, shelving units, inventory logs. A man at a desk near the front, who answered phones and processed paperwork, and had done so for 6 years without incident. The back room was different, smaller. A table, 4 chairs, a laptop, 2 phones, and a whiteboard, currently covered in names and lines and dates, written in Alexandre's own hand, angular, precise, the handwriting of a man who thought in structures. Garrett stood at the door. 2 of his most trusted analysts worked at the table, cross-referencing files, speaking in low, efficient bursts, handing documents back and forth with the focused urgency of people who understood that speed here was not about panic, but about closing the window before it closed on them. Raymond had given them the name of his contact within 2 hours. Dario had confirmed it independently, without knowing Raymond had already spoken, which meant the information was reliable, not constructed to satisfy, not coordinated between them, but real. The name was a man called Philip Soar, mid-level coordinator for a syndicate operating out of Portland, that had spent the better part of 18 months expanding its reach southward, quietly, incrementally, buying territory through financial pressure rather than direct confrontation. Intelligent, conservative, the kind of expansion strategy that avoided attention precisely because it avoided spectacle. Until now, Philip Soar was not the architect. Alexandra knew this, without being told. The same instinct that had kept him alive through situations that should have ended him told him that a man of Philip's profile was a mechanism, not a mind. He moved pieces. He didn't arrange the board. The board had been arranged by someone above him. It took Alexandra's team 36 hours to find the thread. It came, as most important things did, not from dramatic revelation, but from patient accumulation. A financial record here, a communication log there, a name that appeared twice in documents that should have had no connection to each other, and then a third time, and then the shape of it became visible, the way a face emerges from static, when you stop trying to force it and simply let your eyes receive what's there. The name was Theodore Marsh. On paper, Theodore Marsh was exactly what Alexandra had once appeared to be to the uninitiated: a businessman, investments, real estate. A charitable foundation, with a website that listed 3 employees, and had a professional photograph of Theodore himself on the About page, silver-haired, open-faced, the kind of face that had been carefully constructed to communicate trustworthiness. He sat on 2 corporate boards. He attended fundraising dinners. He had a home in Pacific Heights with a view that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. He also, Alexandra now knew, controlled 4 distribution networks across the Pacific coast and had been systematically dismantling the loyalty structures of rival organizations for the past 2 years, not through violence, which left evidence, but through money, which left gratitude. He had recruited Raymond and Dario from a placement agency that, when examined at depth, was not a placement agency at all, but a channel, a mechanism for inserting pre-selected personnel into positions of proximity to people. Theodore wanted removed. He had been thorough. He had simply not been thorough enough. Alexandra spent 1 hour alone in the back room after his team presented their findings. He sent Garrett out. He sat with the whiteboard and the documentation and the particular quality of silence that followed the resolution of uncertainty when you no longer have a question and are simply in the presence of its answer. Theodore Marsh had tried to kill him, had planned it for months, had placed men inside his circle, had prepared a route, a method, a disposal, had, in all likelihood, already identified who would fill the vacuum Alexandra's disappearance would create, and had begun laying groundwork for that transition. He had planned everything except the burgundy dress. Alexandra stood, uncapped his marker, and drew a single line through Theodore Marsh's name on the whiteboard. What followed was not the kind of thing that appeared in police reports or news articles or any documentation that existed in the legitimate world. Alexandra's response was the kind that traveled through the city's underworld in fragments and whispers, pieces of information that, assembled together, told a story that no one with sense repeated above a murmur. Within 72 hours, Theodore Marsh's 4 distribution networks experienced simultaneous failures, not dramatic, not violent in any visible public sense, but complete. Partnerships dissolved. Personnel disappeared. Financial channels closed overnight, with the finality of doors that had been not just shut, but sealed. Within a week, Theodore Marsh himself was no longer a concern. There were no public records of what happened. There was no investigation, because there was no report, because there was no one left with both the knowledge of what had occurred and the desire to speak about it. The charitable foundation's website went offline. The About page photograph of the silver-haired, open-faced man was simply gone. The message, delivered in the language Alexandra's world understood, not words, not threats, but consequence, was received by every organization operating within 200 miles. Betrayal had a cost. The invoice had been paid in full. Alexandra stood at the window of the import building's back room on the evening of the 4th day and looked at the city. San Francisco glowed amber and blue in the early dark, indifferent and beautiful, conducting its 10,000 simultaneous lives without any awareness of what had moved through it this week. He thought about the 34th floor of the Meridian Tower, the meeting that had seemed, at the time, like the most significant thing that had happened that evening. He thought about how wrong he had been. He reached for his phone. There was something he needed to find out. He found the answer in 40 minutes. Not because it was difficult. Alexandra had access to resources that made finding people straightforward when he chose to use them, but because he spent 30 of those 40 minutes not looking, sitting instead in the back room of the import building, with his phone face down on the table and his hands flat on either side of it, thinking about something he rarely allowed himself to think about, himself. Not strategy, not the organization, not threat assessment or resource allocation, or any of the 100 operational considerations that normally occupied the space behind his eyes. Just himself. The version of him that had existed for the past 15 years. The architecture of a life built deliberately, brick by careful brick, on the foundational principle that proximity was danger and trust was a transaction, and sentiment was the specific vulnerability that brought powerful men to their knees. He had believed this completely. He had believed it the way structural engineers believe in load-bearing walls, not emotionally, not with passion, but with the quiet, absolute conviction of someone who has seen what happens when the principle is violated. He had watched men he knew, men of genuine capability and hard-earned power, collapse because they trusted the wrong person. A partner, a brother, a woman, someone who had been given access to the interior of their world and had used that access as a weapon. Alexandra had decided, at 26 years old, that he would not be among them. He had built walls, not metaphorical ones, actual operational distances. He maintained relationships at the temperature of professional respect, and nothing warmer. He approved every hire personally. He verified every verification. He had created a structure around himself that was designed, above all else, to ensure that the only person whose judgment he was fully exposed to was his own. And in the 4th month of that structure, 2 men had walked through it. Clean records, strong references, a placement agency that had existed specifically to get them there. All of it constructed with patience and intelligence by a man Alexandra had never personally encountered, who had studied him from a distance and identified not a weakness in his operation, but a weakness in his assumption, the assumption that thoroughness and trust were the same thing. They were not the same thing. He had been thorough. He had not been wise. Alexandra picked up his phone, put it back down, stood and walked to the window, and looked at the city for a while, the way he sometimes looked at things when he needed to let his mind work without directing it, giving the thoughts room to arrange themselves without interference. The girl came back to him fully then, not as a detail, not as a fact to be processed and filed. She came back as an image complete and specific, and somehow heavier than he expected. The burgundy dress, the loose dark hair, the way she had moved through those glass doors with her small legs carrying her faster than her composure could quite keep up with. The hand reaching for his sleeve, not grabbing, not demanding, just touching, as if she understood that she had no authority here and was appealing to something other than authority. She had been shaking. He remembered this clearly, the slight tremor in her extended hand, the way her voice had controlled itself with visible effort, keeping the words steady while everything beneath them was frightened. She was 7 years old. She had walked out of a building lobby toward a man that grown adults crossed streets to avoid, surrounded by his armed detail, and she had touched his sleeve and told him the truth, not because it was safe, because it was right. Alexandra put his palm flat against the window glass, cold from the outside. He thought about the moment he had turned away from her. He had needed to strategically. It was the correct move, showing no reaction, revealing nothing to the men who were watching. But he remembered the look on her face as he walked toward the car anyway, the way the outstretched hand stayed extended for a moment after he had stopped responding to it. The particular expression of a child who has done the hardest thing they could imagine, and then watched it appear to make no difference. He had put that expression on her face. He had done it deliberately, and it had been necessary, and it had saved his life, and he had been thinking about it for 4 days. Power, he had always told himself, required a certain distance from feeling. Not the absence of it. He had never been naive enough to believe he was without feeling, but the management of it. The placement of emotion in its correct position, subordinate to analysis, useful when channeled but dangerous when uncontrolled. He had managed it for 15 years. He was finding, tonight, that some things did not respond to management. A child had heard what his vetted professionals had not heard, had understood what his security apparatus had not understood, had acted when every instinct toward self-preservation should have told her to sit back down in her chair and wait for her mother and let the man in the black suit handle his own problems. She had none of the things his world considered qualifications. She had simply paid attention and cared. and chosen to act on what she knew, despite having no power to enforce the outcome. He had spent 15 years building power. She had walked out of a lobby with nothing but the truth and her grandmother's language lessons and a willingness to try. He stayed at the window a long time. When he finally picked up his phone, he called Garrett. "The woman who was in the building that evening," he said. "Job interview. Lower floor. She had a daughter with her." A pause. "Find them. Quietly. I want to know her situation. Employment, financial, housing, everything. Don't approach them." "Understood," Garrett said. "Timeline?" Alexandra looked at the city. He thought about a small hand against his sleeve. He thought about a voice keeping itself steady through sheer force of will. He thought about what it cost a person, any person, regardless of age, to walk toward something frightening and speak anyway. "Tonight," he said. He ended the call. For the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, Alexandra Duarte stood alone in a room and felt something that his carefully constructed life had very little vocabulary for: gratitude, raw, unmanageable, and entirely without precedent. It sat in his chest like a stone that had been placed there gently. He did not try to move it. Garrett's report came back before midnight. Alexandra read it twice, not because it was complicated, it wasn't, but because the simplicity of it required a moment to sit with. The woman's name was Grace Walker, 31 years old, single mother, originally from Portland, relocated to San Francisco 8 months ago following the death of her mother, Angel's grandmother, the woman who had taught a 7-year-old girl Mandarin at a kitchen table and changed the course of at least one man's life without ever knowing it. Grace had been working 2 part-time positions, a morning shift at a bakery in the Richmond district, and evening data entry work for a small logistics company that paid poorly and offered nothing in the way of stability or advancement. The job interview at the Meridian Tower had been for an administrative coordinator position, a role that would have provided consistent income, health coverage, and the kind of reliable foundation that 2 part-time jobs fundamentally could not. She had interviewed well, according to the hiring manager's internal notes, which Garrett had obtained through channels Alexandra did not ask him to specify. She had not been selected. The position had gone to another candidate 3 days after the interview, 2 days after the evening. Alexandra had walked out of that building, and Angel had run after him in her red dress, and everything had changed. Grace Walker did not know that the man whose life her daughter had saved was aware she existed. She did not know that his team had spent an evening compiling the quiet arithmetic of her struggle, the gap between what she earned and what she needed, the careful management of a life being held together by will and precision, and the determination of a woman who had not yet allowed herself to stop trying. Alexandra set the report down. He slept 4 hours, rose before dawn, made 1 call. He arrived at the Meridian Tower at 9:47 in the morning. No announcement. No entourage beyond Garrett, who walked 3 steps behind and to the left with the practiced invisibility of a man who had learned how to be present without being noticed. Alexandra wore the same quality of suit as always, dark, impeccable, no tie, but something in his bearing was different this morning. The cold dominance that normally preceded him into rooms was still there, because it was structural now, built into the way he moved, but it was accompanied by something else, something quieter, a purposefulness that was not about power but about debt. He had debts very rarely. He paid them completely. The lobby receptionist looked up as he approached, and the familiar recalibration happened, that unconscious widening of attention, the slight straightening of posture that people performed in the presence of someone whose gravity they could feel before they could name it. Alexandra gave her Grace Walker's name and told her he needed to speak with the hiring manager. His tone left no space for the question of whether this was possible. It was possible. The hiring manager, a composed woman in her 40s named Patricia Ellison, appeared from the elevator bank 7 minutes later with the careful expression of someone who had been told an unexpected visitor was waiting and had spent the elevator ride preparing for uncertainty. She extended her hand. Alexandra shook it. "I understand you recently had a candidate for your administrative coordinator position," he said. "Grace Walker." Patricia's composure held. "The role has been filled, mister." "I'm aware," Alexandra said. "I'd like you to call her." A pause. "I'm not sure I understand." "She interviewed for a position in this building," Alexandra said. "I'd like you to offer her one. The salary should reflect senior coordination level. Benefits comprehensive. Start date at her convenience." He held Patricia's gaze with the particular steadiness that had ended longer negotiations than this. "I'll be covering the cost differential through a consulting arrangement my office will formalize by end of day. You won't carry any financial exposure. Patricia looked at him for a long moment. May I ask why? She said. Alexandre considered the question. Her daughter did something difficult, he said, and it mattered. Grace Walker arrived at the Meridian Tower at 2 p.m, having received a call from Patricia Ellison, asking if she could come in at her earliest convenience regarding a new development in her application. The call had been careful and professional, and had given nothing away. Grace had spent the subway ride preparing herself for a second interview, rehearsing answers, straightening her collar in the dark reflection of the train window, willing herself into the composed and capable version of herself that the situation required. She walked through the revolving doors in a gray blazer and dark trousers, her hair pulled back. Angel was beside her. School had closed early for a staff development day, and Grace had had no alternative but to bring her. Angel walked with her hand in her mother's, wearing a pale blue dress today, not the burgundy one, her dark eyes moving through the lobby with the same quiet absorption they always carried. She saw him before her mother did. Alexandra was standing near the far side of the lobby, not seated, not performing impatience, simply present, jacket buttoned, hands at his sides, watching the revolving doors with an expression that Angel had not seen on his face before. It was not the unreadable cold of the man on the steps. It was not the controlled stillness of the back seat. It was something more open than either. Something that looked, on a face like his, almost unfamiliar to itself. Angel stopped walking. Her mother took 2 more steps before she realized and turned. Angel, come on. But Angel was looking at him, and he was looking at her. Alexandra crossed the lobby. Grace watched this man approach this unmistakable, impossible to misread man, and felt her hand tighten around her daughter's automatically. The instinctive protective reflex of a mother who did not yet understand what was happening. Mrs. Walker, Alexandra said. His voice was measured, respectful. My name is Alexandra Duarte. I apologize for the unusual circumstances. I asked the building to contact you because I wanted to speak with you personally. He paused. Your daughter and I met briefly last week. Grace looked down at Angel. Angel looked up at her mother with the expression of a child who had been carrying something large and secret, and was only now, finally, setting it down. You knew? Grace said softly. I didn't want to scare you, Angel said. Grace closed her eyes for 1 second, then opened them. Alexandra was already lowering himself a slight bend at the knee, bringing his eye level toward Angel's, the movement of a large and powerful man making himself deliberately smaller. It was not comfortable for him. It was visible in the slight stiffness of it, the physical unfamiliarity. But he did it. He looked at Angel directly. You saved my life, he said. 3 words, carrying the weight of 4 days of reflection, of a whiteboard covered in names, of a dark road and asphalt, and 2 men on their knees, of a window and a city and a stone, placed gently in a chest that had not expected to receive it. Angel looked at him with her steady dark eyes. I heard them, she said simply. I couldn't not tell you. Something moved across Alexandra's face, brief and real and unmanaged. He held her gaze a moment longer. Then he straightened and turned to Grace, who was standing very still with the expression of a woman rapidly reconstructing her understanding of recent events. Your daughter showed more courage last week than most adults I've known, he said. I'd like to do something to acknowledge that, if you'll allow me. Beginning with the position in this building which is yours, if you want it. Unconditionally. Grace opened her mouth, closed it. Why? She finally said the same question Patricia had asked differently, asked from somewhere more vulnerable. Alexandra glanced once more at Angel. Because someone in a red dress taught me something I should have learned a long time ago, he said, that the smallest voice in the room is sometimes the only one telling the truth. Grace pressed her hand to her mouth. Angel reached out and took Alexandra's hand briefly just for a moment. Just the light touch of small fingers against tattooed ones and then let go. The lobby continued around them. Ordinary, unhurried, as if the world had simply made a small, quiet correction and was moving on. The organization felt the change before anyone named it. It moved through Alexandra's world the way temperature moves through a room gradually, imperceptibly, and then, suddenly and completely, so that the people inside it looked up one day and realized the atmosphere had shifted without being able to identify the precise moment it began. The first visible change was structural. Within days of the road confrontation, Alexandra dissolved the external placement arrangement that had supplied Raymond and Dario and 3 other personnel across his operation over the preceding year. Quietly, no announcement. The agency simply stopped receiving contracts, and the men placed through it were reassigned to positions of diminishing access, while Alexandra's team conducted retrospective reviews of every decision they had influenced, every room they had been present in, every conversation they had been close enough to hear. 2 additional vulnerabilities were identified. Neither had been activated yet. Theodore Marsh's network had been dismantled before they could be. But they had existed. They had been there, patient and undetected, inside the architecture Alexandra had believed was sound. He rebuilt it. Not dramatically. Not with the visible urgency of a man who had been frightened, because that was its own kind of signal, and Alexandra did not send signals he hadn't composed deliberately. He rebuilt it methodically, layer by layer, the way you reconstruct something load-bearing, carefully, with attention to every joint and connection, testing each one before trusting it with weight. The vetting process was redesigned from the foundation. References were no longer checked through channels, they were verified through relationships, through people Alexandra trusted personally, through the slow and expensive process of actually knowing the humans who validated the humans he hired. It took longer. It cost more. It produced a security apparatus that was, within 2 months, significantly smaller and exponentially more reliable. He reduced his circle deliberately, not with coldness, or not only with coldness, but with the clear-eyed acknowledgement that a smaller circle of genuine loyalty was worth more than a large one of performed loyalty, and that he had confused the two for long enough. The men who remained understood something had changed. They didn't discuss it, but they felt it in the quality of his attention toward them, more direct, more personal, more willing to acknowledge them as individuals rather than functions. Garrett noticed first. He said nothing about it, because Garrett understood which observations to keep to himself. But Alexandra caught him watching one afternoon with the particular expression of a man recalibrating a long-held assumption, and Alexandra met his eyes and held them for a moment. And something passed between them that was more honest than most conversations. The financial support for Grace and Angel was arranged through a private trust, structured cleanly, legally, with no strings and no visibility. Grace's salary at the Meridian Tower was supplemented quietly to a level that removed financial anxiety as a daily condition of her existence. Angel's education was funded forward through a mechanism that Grace discovered in a letter from a law firm 3 weeks after her first day of work, a letter that explained, in careful professional language, that an anonymous donor had established an educational trust in Angel Walker's name, covering tuition, materials, and supplementary programs through university. Grace sat with that letter for a long time. She thought about the man in the lobby, the slight bend at the knee, the voice that had said, "You saved my life," with the weight of someone who meant it beyond the literal fact of it. She thought about her daughter, who had walked out of a building toward a stranger and told the truth. She framed the letter, not on the wall in a drawer, private, where she could find it on the days that required reminding that the world occasionally made room for extraordinary things. Alexandra did not publicize any of it. This was important to him in a way he didn't fully examine, the instinct to keep it private, to let the gesture exist without an audience, to give without the giving being visible. He had spent his life performing power for an audience that needed to believe in it. This was different. This was something that didn't require performance because it wasn't about him. He found that distinction clarifying in ways he hadn't expected. There were other changes, smaller, less organizational. The way he moved through his days had a slightly different quality, a marginally greater willingness to pause, to register, to allow information from unexpected sources to reach him before he had decided whether it was relevant. He found himself noticing things he had trained himself to filter out. A conversation between 2 of his men that revealed something about their circumstances he hadn't known. A detail in a report that, when he followed it rather than passing over it, led somewhere useful. He had built his career on the assumption that the most important information came from the most credentialed sources. That expertise announced itself with track records and references, and the accumulated endorsements of the powerful. A 7-year-old girl had disassembled that assumption in 30 seconds. He was paying attention differently now. Not softly, he was not a soft man and had no interest in becoming one, but attentively, with the recognition that the world communicated through every available channel, and that a man who only listened to the channels he expected was a man who would always be surprised by the ones he dismissed. He thought about Angel periodically, not obsessively, but the image returned: the burgundy dress, the steady eyes, the hand reaching with the regularity of something that had been filed not in short-term memory, but somewhere more permanent. Something his mind had decided mattered enough to keep accessible. She had not hesitated because she calculated that the odds of being believed were favorable. She had not acted because she was certain of the outcome. She had moved because she knew something, and the knowing required action, and she had not been willing to let the gap between those two things remain open. Alexandra had known many men who called themselves brave. He had met very few who actually were. The cafe was called Prism. It occupied the ground floor of a building, 2 blocks from the Meridian Tower, a narrow, warm space with large windows that let the afternoon light in at an angle that turned everything it touched briefly golden. Grace had been working there on weekend mornings since the owner, a woman named Delphine who had hired her on the basis of one conversation and a genuine instinct about people, had offered her a second role that fit around her weekday position at the Meridian Tower. She hadn't needed the extra income anymore. Not really. She came because she liked Delphine, because the cafe smelled like cardamom and good coffee and something she could only describe as ordinary life running well. Because Angel loved to sit at the corner table by the window and do her homework while the weekend moved past outside. It was a Saturday morning. Angel was at the corner table, her exercise book open, a pencil moving in careful loops across the page. She was working on something mathematics, or possibly a story. It was difficult to tell from the way she held the pencil, with the total absorption of a child who had located the exact frequency of concentration and was living inside it completely. Grace was behind the counter, explaining something to a new weekend employee. When the bell above the door sounded, she looked up. Alexandra Duarte stepped into Prism. He was alone. No Garrett, no detail. Just the man himself in a dark jacket, collar open, the morning light catching the ink at his neck and hands as he ducked slightly through the doorway and straightened and looked around the cafe with the same assessing attention he brought to every space he entered. His eyes found Angel first. She looked up from her exercise book at the same moment that instinctive awareness children have of being looked at, and for a half second, the cafe contracted around just the two of them. The man who owned the night, the girl who had walked into it anyway. Angel smiled. It was a small smile. Not performed, not relieved, just real. The smile of someone who sees a person they are genuinely glad to see, uncomplicated by any of the weight that surrounded it. Alexandra crossed the cafe and stopped at the edge of her table. Working, he said. Mathematics, Angel said. I don't like it very much. Neither did I. She looked at him with the directness that had not changed since the first evening. Did you get better at it? I hired people who were, he said. Angel considered this with the seriousness it deserved. That's probably smart. Alexandra looked at the chair across from her, an ordinary wooden chair. He looked at it the way a man looks at something small that is asking something of him. Then he pulled it out and sat down. Grace appeared at the table with 2 cups coffee for Alexandra, without being asked, and hot chocolate for Angel. Because Saturday and looked at the two of them sitting across from each other in the corner of her cafe and felt something she didn't have immediate language for, something that lived in the neighborhood of wonder, of the world being stranger and larger and more capable of surprising corrections than she had believed when she was filling out that application in a lobby while her daughter sat nearby in a red dress. She set the cups down and went back to the counter and didn't interrupt. Alexandra wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. The tattoos on his knuckles caught the golden morning light, all those marks and histories, all that visible record of a life lived at edges. Are you still afraid of me? He asked Angel. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. I was scared that evening, she said. Not of you. Of whether you'd believe me. He nodded slowly. I believed you, he said. I just couldn't show it. I know, she said. I figured that out later. He looked at her. How? Because you got in the car prepared? Angel said simply. You wouldn't have done that if you hadn't believed me. Alexandra was quiet for a moment. Outside, the Saturday street was doing what Saturday streets do unhurried, populated with the specific texture of a city at rest, people walking without agendas, the ordinary beautiful business of lives being lived without drama or consequence. Your grandmother, Alexandra said. She taught you well. Angel's expression shifted not to sadness exactly, but to something adjacent to it, the particular look of someone touching a memory they love and miss simultaneously. She said language was the most powerful thing she could give me. She was right. She usually was. Alexandra lifted his coffee, set it down, looked at the exercise book, at the careful pencil loops on the page, at the child who had walked out of a lobby toward the most feared man in the city with nothing but the truth and the willingness to speak it. Angel, he said. She looked up. Thank you, he said. Not the formal acknowledgement in the lobby, not the transaction of the trust fund and the employment offer and the careful financial architecture of gratitude. Just the 2 words, in the corner of a cafe on a Saturday morning, between a man who had learned to listen and a girl who had always known how to speak. Angel looked at him steadily with her grandmother's eyes. You're welcome, she said, and went back to her mathematics. Alexandra sat with his coffee and the morning light and the ordinary sound of a cafe doing what cafes do. And for the first time in a very long time, he was simply present in a moment, without calculating what came next. The black sedan was parked outside. It would be there when he was ready. He was not ready yet. Thanks for sticking with this story until the very end. You're the reason these stories feel alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to read your thoughts and connect with you in the comments.